The villagers still struggle to describe what they saw that night. Some say the memory has blurred at the edges, like an old photograph left too long in sunlight. Others insist they remember every second with painful clarity, the color of the sky, the silence that settled over the valley, the strange pressure in the air as if something enormous was about to descend. They all agree on one thing: the sky was never meant to look like that. It began shortly after midnight, when most of the village was asleep. A cold wind moved through the narrow dirt lanes, rattling loose shutters and stirring dry leaves that had piled against old stone walls. There was nothing unusual about the wind, nothing that hinted at what would come next. But then the dogs began to grow restless. Not barking, not whining, just pacing, circling, their bodies rigid as if sensing something humans could not. At 12:47 a.m., according to one villager who happened to glance at the clock, the air shifted. The breeze halted mid-gust, falling into a steadiness that felt unnatural. For one suspended moment, the entire village held its breath. And then, the sky lit up. Not with lightning. Not with fire. But with a deep, pulsing red glow that seemed to stretch across the heavens like an omen carved into the clouds. It wasn't the color of dawn or sunset, nor the red of a distant wildfire. It was darker, heavier, almost blood-like. As though the sky itself had opened a wound. A few villagers woke thinking their homes were on fire. Others believed the glow was coming from the forest ridge, where old logging roads led into the mountains. One man, a retired farmer named Ghani, would later swear he saw something moving inside the crimson light, not a bird, not a plane, but something wider, shifting as though alive. But he admitted he had old eyes and preferred people think he was mistaken rather than tell the whole truth of what he believed he saw. Within minutes, people stepped out of their homes. They gathered silently in the streets, staring upward, their faces painted red by the eerie glow. Even the children, usually terrified of the dark, moved closer to their parents without a sound, clutching their sleeves, their eyes wide. It wasn't just the sky, they felt the change too. A low hum, almost inaudible, vibrated through the wooden planks of the houses, through the soil, through the bones of anyone standing on it. The villagers looked at each other, unsure if anyone else felt it. No one spoke at first. No one dared. An old woman whispered a prayer under her breath. Another muttered that she had seen this once before, many decades ago, when she was just a child, but she refused to elaborate. A teenage boy, filming on his phone, pointed out that the clouds weren't moving at all. Even the wind had died. The entire world seemed frozen except for the red light overhead. And then came the first scream. It came from the northern edge of the village, somewhere near the abandoned well. Sharp, short, and abruptly cut off. Some villagers flinched. Others gasped. But no one ran toward the sound. They stood rooted in place, as if their bodies refused to move without permission from whatever force was watching them from above. The second scream didn't come. Instead, a strange silence stretched across the night, thick and suffocating. The kind of silence where even your heartbeat feels too loud. A few villagers called out names, friends, siblings, neighbors, but got no response. The red sky throbbed once, almost like a heartbeat, and several people swore they felt the ground tremble lightly beneath them. More dogs began to howl. Not at the sky, at the forest. One young mother clutched her daughter close and begged her husband to go inside. But he wouldn't. Something in the glow transfixed him, as if it were calling to him in a voice that wasn't sound but instinct. Later, he wouldn't be able to explain it, only that the sky made him remember something he had forgotten long ago, something he couldn't quite grasp. At 1:06 a.m., the glow began to intensify, bleeding deeper into the valley. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting like fingers across the ground. A few villagers covered their eyes. Others began praying louder. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the red light began to flicker. Once, twice, and then the sky went black. Total darkness swallowed the village. For several seconds, no one moved. When lanterns finally came alight, people found themselves trembling, some without realizing it. Parents rushed to gather their children. Doors slammed shut. Curtains were pulled closed. The villagers retreated indoors as if a predator prowled the streets. Only a handful remained outside, staring at the now empty, starless sky. Among them was an elderly man who had lived in the village longer than anyone else. He whispered 4 words that chilled the air more than the wind ever could. It wasn't the sky. When someone asked him what he meant, he shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "It's what comes after," he said. "At dawn." And though nobody yet knew what the morning would reveal, every person who heard him felt the truth settle in their stomach like a stone. Whatever had happened tonight was only the beginning. The village sits tucked between 2 unforgiving mountain ridges, as if the earth itself intended to hide it from the rest of the world. Narrow dirt pathways twist like old veins between stone houses that have seen more winters than the people living inside them. Outsiders rarely visit, and when they do, they leave with a strange unease they can't quite explain. Those who stay long enough often sense it, an invisible heaviness in the air, as though the land remembers things the villagers would rather forget. By daylight, the village looks ordinary: terracotta roofs, weathered wood, and fields that stretch out in uneven patches. But even under the sun, the shadows here feel longer. The locals move with a quiet caution, speaking in low tones, especially when discussing matters tied to the forest or the mountains. It's a place where superstition isn't just tradition, it's survival. Long before the night the sky turned red, the village had witnessed its share of oddities. Livestock disappeared without a trace. Children spoke of figures watching them from tree lines. Travelers passing through often complained of losing their way the moment they stepped off the main road, as if the forest played tricks on their sense of direction. Elders recorded these incidents in stories passed through generations, each tale carrying subtle warnings: don't walk alone after dusk, don't ignore strange noises, and above all, never follow lights in the forest. Some villagers laugh these warnings off, calling them old-world fears, but even the skeptics avoid certain areas after sunset. The village's history is woven with threads of dread, and no one truly knows where the first thread began. Among the elders is Bibi Rahil, a woman whose age no one can precisely guess. Some say she's in her late 70s, others insist she must be older. She carries a memory sharper than most, especially regarding the village's past. On the morning after the red sky, when the villagers gathered in the square, she spoke with a trembling certainty that unsettled even the bravest. "This has happened before," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves brushing stone. A few people dismissed her words at first. But when she returned hours later carrying an old, cracked leather journal, suddenly no one laughed. The journal belonged to her grandfather, a man rumored to have gone mad in his final days. Most believed his writings were the ramblings of a deteriorating mind. But Bibi Rahil believed otherwise. She always had. The villagers watched as she opened the journal with thin, shaking fingers. The smell of old paper drifted out, brittle and damp. Inside were pages filled with cramped handwriting, documenting events no one living had ever spoken of: sudden storms with no clouds, nights where the moon seemed too close, and a terrifying description of a sky that glowed red, almost identical to what the villagers had seen hours earlier. The entry was dated 1923. What unsettled everyone most wasn't the description itself, it was the fear in the writing. Her grandfather, known to be a stoic and rational man, recorded feeling an overwhelming sense of dread as the sky turned crimson. He wrote of villagers disappearing, of strange markings found in the fields, of animals behaving with unnatural aggression. And he ended the entry with a line that chilled everyone who heard it: "The sky warns us, but dawn reveals the debt." Before anyone could ask what debt meant, Bibi Rahil shut the journal abruptly, her eyes wet but determined. She insisted the village had been dealing with a cycle, something that returned every few generations. Something the elders had tried to ignore, hoping time would bury it like the dead. But the past never stays buried here. Younger villagers rolled their eyes, claiming the old journal was nothing more than superstition. But deep down, many remembered small signs, stories their grandparents told them, unexplained disappearances that no police report could account for, whispers of a pact forged by the village founders. A pact, they said, made out of desperation on a night much like the one they had just lived through. Then there was Inspector Adil, a retired police officer who settled in the village a decade ago after losing a case that still haunted him. He spent years studying unsolved disappearances around the region, believing some tragedies shared a pattern. Locals respected him, though they sensed he carried a weight he never spoke about. When he heard of the red sky and Bibi Rahil's journal, something in his expression shifted, a recognition, a connection, as though this event aligned with a piece of a puzzle he had been assembling for years. He wasn't from the village, but he understood fear intimately. As the villagers discussed the journal and the omens of the past, Adil quietly walked toward the northern ridge, scanning the tree-line the way a trained investigator does when danger is present. He noticed something subtle, birds refusing to fly over a particular patch of forest. They circled around it instead, forming a broken ring in the sky. Inside the village, children clung to their parents, asking if the red sky meant the world was ending. Parents reassured them with soft lies, but even they avoided looking upward for too long. The older villagers exchanged glances heavy with unspoken truths. They remembered stories their parents told them, stories dismissed as folklore but suddenly too close to reality. The uneasy quiet that settled over the village was unlike anything before. It wasn't the silence after a storm. It was the silence before an unanswered question, one that everyone feared the morning might resolve. And then, just as the villagers began to disperse, Bibi Rahil spoke again, almost to herself. "The sky is only the sign," she murmured. "It's what follows that decides who stays, and who doesn't." Her words hung in the air like smoke, dark and suffocating. Some villagers turned and walked away quickly, unwilling to entertain her meaning. Others stood frozen, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on them. None of them realized that the village's history wasn't whispering warnings anymore, it was repeating itself. And the dawn that awaited them would force every buried secret back into the light. The night had already unsettled the villagers long before the first scream cut through the air. Even after the red sky faded into darkness, nobody truly relaxed. Doors were locked twice over, lamps burned longer than usual, and whispers lingered in every home. Parents tucked their children into bed with shaking hands, telling them the glow was just a strange weather event, though they themselves didn't believe it. By 2:15 a.m., the village had quieted again, but it was not the peaceful stillness they knew. This silence felt watchful, as if something unseen walked just beyond the houses, just beyond the tree line, waiting. It was around this time that strange behaviors began among the animals. The horses in the central stable began kicking against their stalls. Goats bleated loudly and repeatedly, as though sensing a predator. The dogs were the most affected, whining, trembling, noses pressed to the ground before suddenly backing away, tails tucked between their legs. One dog, a brave old shepherd named Nero who had never flinched in his life, let out a guttural, broken howl and bolted from his owner's yard, disappearing into the darkness. That was when a few villagers stepped outside again, lanterns in hand. It was unusual, they thought, that the animals reacted hours after the event. Normally, after a disturbance, livestock calmed down once the environment returned to normal. But this felt like a delayed echo, the aftershock of something that had not entirely left. At 2:29 a.m., a faint metallic ringing drifted from the direction of the abandoned well. Most people ignored it, thinking it was nothing but wind brushing against old structures. But Inspector Adil, who had barely slept since the red flare, recognized that sound immediately. It wasn't metal clanging. It was something tapping metal. Purposefully. Still, he told himself not to jump to conclusions. Across the village, a family living near the northern edge was experiencing their own terror. 17-year-old Sana, who had been restless since witnessing the sky's glow, complained of hearing whispers outside her window. When her father checked, he saw nothing but the thick darkness, yet even he admitted he felt a presence, a sensation that someone was standing just beyond his line of sight. Down the road, a group of young boys, who had sneaked out earlier to investigate the glow, now regretted their bravado. They stood huddled behind an overturned cart, whispering in panic as the trees beyond swayed even though there was no wind. One swore he saw a figure crouched near the base of an old fir tree, watching them. When he blinked, it was gone. And then it happened, the scream. It pierced the night with a clarity so sudden and sharp that everyone felt it in their chest. A woman's voice, unmistakably frightened, echoing from the northern side of the village. House lights flicked on instantly. Doors flew open. People rushed out clutching lanterns, torches, and in some cases, kitchen knives. But something was wrong. The scream ended abruptly, as if someone had placed a hand over her mouth, or as if the scream had been swallowed by the darkness itself. Neighbors gathered quickly in the open area near the well, breath visible in the cool night air. They expected the woman to shout again, to cry for help, to give them direction. But the night remained unervingly silent. Inspector Adil arrived moments later, carrying a flashlight and an old service revolver he hoped he would never have to use again. He scanned the area, his mind already racing through possibilities: accident, animal attack, a person in distress. But none of those explanations matched the feeling gripping his gut. The villagers spread out in small groups, calling out the names of anyone they thought might be missing. The voice, that single, terrified scream, had not been recognizable enough to identify. Some believed it belonged to Farah, a widow living alone near the edge of the village. Others thought it might be her teenage daughter. But when they raced to Farah's house, they found her and her daughter inside, trembling but unharmed. The search widened. A group of men moved toward the northern ridge, their lantern lights trembling across the ground. The forest loomed ahead like a wall of ink. Sana pointed toward the path leading to the old well, insisting she heard something move there earlier. Nobody dismissed her, not after the sky they witnessed. When they reached the well, they froze. The well's wooden cover, which had always remained sealed to prevent accidents, was slightly open, just enough for something or someone to slip through. The men exchanged uneasy glances. One bent down to lift the lid fully, but Adil stopped him, shaking his head. "Not yet," he murmured. "Look around first." The ground near the well revealed disturbance, footprints, several of them, leading away from the houses. But they were strange. Too deep in some places, too shallow in others, as though the person walked with an uneven weight. And then the tracks veered sharply toward the forest. As the villagers followed the trail, something caught their attention: a piece of cloth snagged on a thorn bush. Torn, dirty, and stretched as though ripped during a struggle. A few meters ahead, another fragment lay in the soil, half buried. The fabric was familiar. It belonged to someone local. When they lifted the cloth, several women gasped. It was the shawl of Miriam, the schoolteacher who had not been seen since earlier that evening. Adil crouched down, picking up the shawl with slow, deliberate movements. The edges were frayed unnaturally, as though pulled apart instead of cut. He looked back at the villagers, their faces pale, breaths shallow. The trail continued deeper into the forest, but then, it ended. Abruptly. The footprints simply stopped. No turn. No leap. No drag marks. As if the person had vanished mid-step. A heavy silence settled over the search party. Someone whispered, "Where did she go?" But no one had the courage to answer. Only Adil spoke, his voice low. "Something's wrong. Very wrong." The lanterns flickered. The wind picked up for the first time since the sky had glowed red. And somewhere deeper in the forest, an echo, soft, distant, rose into the night. It wasn't a scream this time. It was a laugh. Faint, broken, and not entirely human. And the villagers knew, the sky turning red had not been the climax of the night. It had only been the warning. Dawn arrived slowly, hesitantly, as if the sun itself feared looking down upon the village. When the first faint ribbon of light stretched across the sky, it carried no warmth, no comfort. Instead, it exposed the long, sleepless night carved into every villager's face. No one had truly rested, doors stayed unlocked, lanterns burned until their oil ran dry, and entire families huddled together waiting for the light that felt overdue. But daylight did not bring safety. It brought clarity. And clarity brought terror. The first to step outside were the farmers, those accustomed to greeting the morning before anyone else. But this morning, they didn't move with routine. They moved with dread. The sky was pale, almost washed out, but the ground held the secrets the night had left behind. A farmer named Rafik stumbled upon the first sign. His field, which had been freshly tilled 2 days earlier, now held patterns burned into the soil. Perfect, circular scorch marks, each ring darker toward the center, as though something intensely hot had pressed into the earth but left no ashes behind. He touched the dirt, it was still warm. By the time he exhaled in shock, another villager called out from the far side of the field. More symbols, lines intersecting, curves looping into one another with mathematical precision no ordinary hand could create. They looked ancient, ritualistic, yet too flawless to have been drawn by human tools. Birds refused to land anywhere near them. Within minutes, half the village had gathered around the scorched patterns. Murmurs rose, some fearful, some in denial. Children clutched their mothers. Elders exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. "It's the same," whispered one of them. "Just like in the old stories." Inspector Adil arrived shortly after, exhausted but alert. When he saw the markings, he paused, not in confusion, but in recognition. He had seen similar patterns years ago during a missing person investigation in a northern village. But those patterns had been shallow, disorganized. These were deliberate. These felt like warnings. He ordered everyone to step back, which most obeyed, but one man, Imran, a young and eager villager, approached the center of the largest circle. Before anyone could stop him, he reached out to touch the darkest part of the scorched soil. His hand recoiled instantly. Not because it burned him. Because it was cold. Ice cold. The soil within the scorch marks, instead of being charred or fragile, felt unnaturally frigid. As if heat had never touched it at all. The villagers backed away even further now, forming a wider circle around the strange patterns. And that was when a child, no older than 8, tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed toward the forest's edge. "Look, someone's lying there." Everyone turned. Near the tree lean, a shape lay motionless on the ground. A human shape. Inspector Adil and 2 others ran toward it. The closer they got, the slower their steps became. The air around the body grew still, unnervingly still, like a trapped bubble of silence. Even the wind seemed to avoid the area. It was Miriam. The missing schoolteacher. But something about her was wrong. Terribly, impossibly wrong. She lay on her back, arms placed neatly at her sides, as if arranged deliberately. Her body wasn't twisted or bruised. Her clothing wasn't torn. There was no blood, no wounds, no signs of struggle. Yet she was unmistakably dead. Her face held an expression of pure terror, eyes wide open, mouth parted slightly, as if she had died mid-gasp. The villagers who approached froze at the sight. Some covered their mouths. Others took a step back. Because Miriam's eyes. They weren't just wide with fear. They were reflective, almost glass-like, as though something had burned the image of her last moments into them. In the morning light, her pupils seemed to shimmer faintly, as if holding a memory she could not speak. Inspector Adil knelt beside her, forcing himself to remain steady. He checked her pulse, knowing he wouldn't find one. Then he examined her skin. No bruises. No ligature marks. No frostbite, despite the cold radiating from the soil near the patterns. But when he lifted her hand, he froze. Her fingertips were covered in a thin layer of soot-like residue. Black, powdery, clinging to her skin. Yet her clothes bore no burns, and her body showed no signs of heat exposure. How could her fingers be burned, but the rest of her untouched? He scanned the surroundings and noticed something else, something smaller yet infinitely more disturbing. Miriam's shoes were missing. Not torn off. Not removed violently. Simply gone. No footprints surrounded her body. No drag marks. No sign she had walked there. The earth beneath her showed no indentations at all. As if she had been placed there from above. By now, villagers crowded at the edge of the field, whispering in fear. Bibi Rahil arrived last, leaning heavily on her cane. When she saw Miriam, she pressed her trembling hand to her lips. "Heaven protect us," she whispered. "It has begun again." Adil swallowed hard, his mind refusing to accept superstition, but logic offered no explanation. The scorched symbols. The cold soil. The missing shoes. The terrified expression. And the impossibility of the scene itself. Before he could stand, another villager called out from behind him. "Adil, there's something else." The inspector turned. A line of small, perfectly round stones, each identical in size, formed a trail leading from Miriam's body toward the forest. They weren't there before. No one remembered seeing them during the night search. The stones glimmered faintly with an oily sheen, unnatural in the morning light. And at the end of the trail, a single metallic object half buried in the soil. Adil brushed away the dirt. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't a tool. It wasn't anything he recognized. But it was warm. Disturbingly warm. Behind him, villagers shifted nervously. Fear thickened in the air, settling like dust. One man finally asked the question nobody wanted to voice. What happened to her? Adil did not answer. He couldn't. Because in Miriam's lifeless eyes, he saw something he would never forget, a reflection of the red sky. And behind it, a shape he prayed had been a trick of light. Yet deep down, he knew it wasn't. As sunlight fully broke over the village, it revealed not comfort, but truth. The night had not ended with darkness. It had left behind something waiting to be understood. Something that did not belong to nature, nor to myth. And dawn, instead of bringing answers, had brought horror into the open. Whatever had come under the red sky had not taken everything it wanted. Not yet. The discovery of Miriam's body should have brought the village together, united in grief and a shared need for answers. Instead, it splintered them. Fear has a way of sharpening suspicion, and by mid-morning, that suspicion had turned neighbor against neighbor. Every glance felt accusatory. Every whisper carried an edge. And every unanswered question began reshaping itself into blame. Inspector Adil knew this would happen. Villages like this, isolated, steeped in generational superstition, were fertile ground for panic. Once hysteria rooted itself, rationality would struggle to survive. He needed to take control fast. But the moment he tried to speak to the villagers, they drowned him out with theories, accusations, and wild suggestions that the forest was awake again. One group pointed fingers at Rahman, the reclusive hunter who lived alone near the eastern ridge. They claimed he roamed the woods at odd hours, spoke to no one, and sometimes returned with scratches he refused to explain. Another group insisted the traveling merchant, who had passed through 2 days before the red sky, must have cursed the land. The most paranoid among them whispered about the family feud between the Hashmis and the Qureshis, insisting the strange symbols were part of a ritual meant to punish rivals. Adil dismissed each theory carefully. None of these people had the means, or the motive, to orchestrate something this elaborate, this chillingly precise. But the villagers needed someone to blame, someone human to direct their fear toward. Anything was better than accepting the possibility that the threat came from something they didn't understand. Amid this chaos, Adil decided to isolate the facts. And the first fact was this: Mariam had not been the only one missing that night. There was another person, Hamza. A quiet, solitary woodcutter in his mid-30s who kept mostly to himself. He wasn't well liked, nor disliked, he simply existed at the fringes of village life, slipping in to buy supplies and slipping out again without conversation. His absence on any normal morning wouldn't have been concerning. But today, it was impossible to ignore. Because the torn cloth found during the night search, the deep and shallow footprints, the broken branches along the northern trail, all pointed to someone else being involved. Whether as a victim, witness, or something else entirely, Adil couldn't yet say. But Hamza's disappearance merged with the growing storm of suspicion sweeping across the village. Adil and 2 volunteers made the short trek to the woodcutter's cabin. It stood alone in a clearing surrounded by thin, dying trees, far enough from the village to feel abandoned, close enough to reach within minutes. The moment they approached the door, Adil felt it, the same wrongness that had clung to the scorched patterns in the field. A stillness that wasn't natural. A cold tension in the air. He pushed the door open. The inside of the cabin was in disarray, but not in a chaotic or frantic way. The disorder followed a pattern, as though someone had searched with purpose, tools removed from shelves and neatly placed on the floor, drawers emptied but their contents arranged in a straight line across the table. Even the blankets on the bed were folded, not tossed aside. Something had entered this room. Or Hamza had left in a hurry with a mind too calm for panic. Adil scanned the room carefully. The table held a lantern still burning low, suggesting it had been lit long after midnight. A wooden cup lay on the floor near the bed, a small trail of spilled water leading toward the door. The footprints inside the cabin were odd, one set belonged to barefoot human steps, the other did not. The second set looked elongated, almost stretched, as though the foot had been pulled forward unnaturally. And worse, they stopped halfway across the room. Vanished. "God help us," whispered one of the volunteers, stepping back. Adil knelt near the footprints, touching the floorboards. They were warm. Heating up, even now. Not from sunlight. But from something that had exerted heat only moments before dawn. When he stood, he noticed something else out of place, a sheet of paper pinned to the wall with a rusty nail. Not pinned neatly, but stabbed into the wood at an angle. The paper was torn from a notebook, the handwriting uneven as though written in haste. It contained only 4 words, "Do not follow me." The men exchanged alarmed looks. Had Hamza written this? If so, what had he seen? What had he been running from? Or, what had he been following? The search around the cabin revealed further strange clues. The ground outside showed signs of a struggle, broken twigs, disturbed soil, and drag marks that abruptly ended near a moss-covered rock. Yet again, the trail simply vanished. It didn't fade, it didn't weaken. It ended with unnatural precision. As if someone had been lifted into the air. Or simply ceased to exist. Adil's mind raced. If Hamza had encountered whatever left the scorch marks in the fields, or whatever killed Mariam, then the threat was far more active than they expected. And far closer. Back in the village, tensions escalated. Families began barricading their homes. Groups formed with makeshift weapons, axes, pitchforks, sticks, anything to give them a false sense of control. Fear bred theories, theories bred accusations, and accusations bred rage. One man stormed toward Rahman's home, insisting the hunter had lured Mariam into the woods. Another shouted that Hamza had always been strange and must have been involved in something dark. The more Adil tried to calm them, the more volatile the crowd became. Then, as if the day hadn't borne enough terror, a chilling revelation emerged. A young boy named Adil claimed to have seen Hamza earlier that night. Not in the forest. Not in the cabin. But near Miriam's school, standing under the red glow, looking up at the sky with an expression Adil described as empty, not like him. The boy swore Hamza's feet weren't touching the ground. Some villagers dismissed it, assuming the child was traumatized. But others latched onto the story eagerly, feeding their growing paranoia. Adil didn't know what to believe. What he did know was that Hamza's disappearance wasn't random. There was intention in the footprints, in the message, in the way the cabin had been disturbed. And whether Hamza had been taken, or had gone willingly, remained the most disturbing question of all. By noon, the village had fractured into pockets of fear-driven distrust. And somewhere within that chaos, a truth was trying to surface. Someone, or something, had orchestrated the night's events with precision. And the first missing man, the quiet woodcutter who nobody noticed until now, might hold the key to understanding what had happened under the blood-red sky. But Hamza was gone. And the forest was growing darker by the hour. By the time the sun moved past its highest point, the forest at the edge of the village seemed to loom larger than usual, as if it had stretched overnight while no one was watching. It stood like a wall, dense, dark, and unnaturally quiet. Children who normally played near the first line of trees refused to go anywhere close. Even the most seasoned hunters avoided the woods, glancing at it only long enough to make sure nothing was moving within. Inspector Adil gathered a small team to enter the forest, though no one volunteered easily. They knew the forest well, every twisted root and narrow trail, but today it felt foreign. The branches hung lower, the paths darker, and the air, heavier. As they approached the forest border, Adil noticed the silence again, the oppressive, unnatural silence that had blanketed the village during the red sky. No birds chirping. No insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed to hold back, refusing to travel deeper than the first few meters. But there was something else too. A faint vibration in the ground. Subtle. Rhythmic. Almost like a heartbeat. The moment their boots crossed the threshold between sunlight and shadow, the temperature dropped sharply. Not enough to freeze breath, but enough to make skin prickle. One of the volunteers, a farmer named Nadim, rubbed his arms and muttered that something was wrong with the air. Adil felt it too, his lungs worked harder here, as though the oxygen had thinned. They moved deeper, carefully marking the trees with chalk in case the forest decided to distort the paths the way villagers often claimed it did. Over the years, dozens of strange stories had emerged from these woods, stories dismissed as exaggerated folklore. People spoke of hearing voices calling their name, of paths looping back to the same tree no matter how far they walked, of lights flickering between branches even on moonless nights. But these were always told around fires, softened with humor and disbelief. Today, no one felt like laughing. About 15 minutes in, they found the first anomaly. A tree, tall, old, its bark weathered from decades of storms, had a long, clean slice carved into it. Not cut by an axe or blade. The cut was too smooth, too precise, as if the wood had been peeled away by heat rather than force. When Adil placed his hand near the wound, the surface felt warm. Just like the footprints near Miriam. Just like the metallic object. Something passed through here, he murmured, echoing his own fear. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. Compass needles spun uselessly. Their map, reliable for years, no longer matched the terrain. Clearings that should have existed did not. Fallen trees they remembered stepping over were suddenly gone. It was as if the forest was rearranging itself around them, shifting subtly, quietly, each time they looked away. One volunteer swore he saw someone standing behind a large oak, just a silhouette, motionless, half-hidden. They rushed to investigate, but when they reached the spot, nothing remained except the bent grass where feet might have stood. Then the dogs stopped. The two hounds brought along for tracking began to whimper. Their ears flattened, tails tucked, bodies trembling as if something unseen was standing right before them. They refused to take another step. One even turned around and bolted toward the village, dragging its leash from the handler's shocked grip. That was when Adil realized something chilling. The forest wasn't just quiet. It wasn't allowing sound. Every footstep, every breath, every rustle felt muted. As though the air swallowed noise before it could escape. He knelt down and tapped a stone. It should have echoed against the trees. It didn't. The silence grew thicker. The team pressed on, though unease crept into every movement. Adil checked the chalk markings often, noticing that some had faded strangely fast, as if the trees themselves absorbed the lines. Half an hour later, they reached a clearing that made all of them stop cold. A perfect circle, identical to the scorched patterns in the field. Only here, instead of burned soil, the trees formed the perimeter, each one leaning slightly outward, as though pushed back by an invisible force. The ground inside the circle was untouched, smooth, undisturbed, as if no living creature had stepped there for years. But something metallic glinted beneath the thin layer of leaves. The volunteers hesitated, but Adil moved forward and brushed the leaves aside. The object underneath was small, a flattened metallic shard with edges too sharp to be natural. It hummed faintly when touched. He felt that same unsettling warmth he had felt on Miriam's fingertips and near the patterns in the fields. A pattern was forming, connecting the village, the bodies, and now the forest. "Look," whispered Nadim suddenly. Adil followed his gaze. Above them, the branches hung motionless, not even swaying despite the breeze they could feel. It was as though the air above the clearing had been sealed off from the rest of the forest. Then came the sound. A low, distant thud. Followed by another. And another. Like footsteps, heavy ones, walking deeper within the forest. Not toward them. But not away either. Just circling. A slow, deliberate orbit. Adil motioned for everyone to stay silent, though silence was the only thing the forest seemed capable of holding. They stood still, breaths shallow, hearts hammering inside their chests. "Something is moving with intention," Adil whispered to himself. A moment later, a sudden rustle, sharp, violent, exploded to their left. They all spun, weapons raised, but found nothing except a few falling leaves. But the rustling continued, behind them now, then in front. It was everywhere. Yet nowhere. Adil's instincts screamed at him, "Leave. Now." He signaled the group to retreat. No one argued. But as they turned back the way they came, the forest revealed its cruelest trick of all. Half the chalk markings they had left, were gone. Wiped clean. Completely erased. A hiss of panic rippled through the men. They doubled their pace, trying to keep calm, trying not to think about the heavy footsteps they had heard circling them. But the forest wasn't done. As they crossed the final stretch before reaching the village border, the last hound, eyes wide with terror, refused to move another step. It planted its paws firmly on the ground and growled at an empty patch of air. Or what appeared to be empty. Because when the dog's growl deepened, the air shimmered, just slightly, like heat waves rising from a distant road. Adil grabbed the hound and yanked it free, forcing his legs to keep moving, refusing to let fear paralyze him. Behind them, the shimmer faded as quickly as it appeared. When they finally exited the forest, breaking back into sunlight, everyone exhaled at once. The pressure lifted immediately, as though a door had been closed behind them. But the relief didn't last. Because at the forest's edge, in the soft mud where they had walked earlier, a new footprint had appeared. Not human. Not animal. Long deep. Unmistakably deliberate. And pointing directly toward the village. While the villagers searched for answers, something inside the forest had begun searching too. And now, it had found a way to step closer. By late afternoon, the villagers gathered again in the central square, desperate for answers, desperate for something human to hold on to as the world around them grew stranger with every passing hour. All eyes turned to Bibi Rahil when she emerged from her home, clutching the old journal in both hands as though it were something sacred, or cursed. She walked slowly, each step heavy with memory. The villagers parted instinctively, creating a path for her as she approached Inspector Adil. He had seen shaken witnesses, irrational fear, even supernatural claims before, but the look in her eyes was different. This wasn't confusion. It was recognition. "Before you ask," she said quietly, "I did not bring this out to frighten you. But to remind you that what happened last night is not new." The crowd shifted uneasily. She sat on a low stone bench, carefully opening the journal. Its pages were yellow and fragile, some edges crumbling at the slightest touch. Yet it had survived decades, almost as though it had been waiting for this moment. "This belonged to my grandfather," she continued, her voice tight with emotion. "He was the village teacher in 1923. They say he went mad in his final years. But madness is often the name we give to truth before we understand it." She turned to a marked page and began to read. The entry described a night eerily similar to the one they had witnessed, a red glow spreading across the sky. Animals panicking. A strange silence falling over the valley. People daring not to step outside. Her grandfather wrote of the way children cried without knowing why, how elders whispered old prayers they had not spoken in decades, and how the air felt thick, heavy, almost alive. But the similarity did not end there. The morning after the red sky in 1923, the village had also found a body. A man named Haroun, positioned carefully, hands at his sides, his expression frozen in horror. No wounds. No signs of struggle. A death with no visible cause. A murmur rippled through the present-day villagers as they exchanged frightened looks. The parallels were undeniable. Adil leaned closer. "What else does it say?" Bibi Rahil turned another page. This one was filled with frantic handwriting, ink darker and strokes heavier, as though her grandfather had written it with trembling hands. "He speaks of symbols in the fields," she said softly. "Shapes burned into the soil. Perfect patterns. Circles. Lines that made no sense to anyone at the time. Just like what we found this morning." Someone in the crowd whispered a prayer. Someone else muttered that the past should have stayed buried. But the most chilling part was still ahead. Her voice wavered as she read the next lines. At the edge of the forest, footsteps appeared, and disappeared. As though the earth swallowed those who walked too close. "No," a villager breathed. "This can't be real. It can't be repeating." "It is," another said, trembling. "We all saw what happened. We know." Adil motioned for silence. "Keep going." When Bibi Rahil turned another page, she hesitated. The entry here was longer, several paragraphs, and her grandfather's tone shifted from frightened to desperate. He described hearing voices at night. Not human voices, something layered, echoing, as though multiple tones were speaking at once. He wrote of a strange metallic scent in the air, of objects found in the forest that did not belong to nature. He wrote of villagers who went missing, only to be found days later with no memory, wandering near the mountains in a daze. But then came the part that made the villagers collectively inhale. "It is not the sky we fear," her grandfather had written. "It is the thing that walks after." Adil's jaw tightened. That line felt too precise, too familiar. It reflected the same instinct he had felt in the forest earlier, that something was moving with intent. Something that had not finished what it began. The villagers leaned closer as Rahil continued. "When the sky turns red, it is a sign. But not of danger. Of awakening. The old stories, those we laughed at, they were warnings left for us. My grandfather told me never to ignore lights in the forest. Never to follow voices. Never to stand near the well." The crowd stirred nervously. The abandoned well had already been a focal point during the night search. But then, something unexpected. One half of a page was missing. Torn out cleanly, leaving a jagged edge that hinted at urgency. Adil frowned. What was written there? We don't know, Bibi Rahil said, shaking her head. The page has been missing since before my father inherited the journal. My grandfather tore it out himself. Why would he do that? A villager asked. Her eyes hardened. Because whatever was written, he didn't want anyone else to read. She turned to the next page, but it held only a single line, written shakily, if it returns, do not let it take the same path again. What path? Another voice cried out. What does it mean? But no one had an answer. The journal then shifted into shorter, disconnected entries, her grandfather's descent into fear, perhaps madness, or perhaps knowledge too heavy for a human mind to hold. He wrote of dreams where the sky pulsed like a living being. Of figures standing in the forest who vanished when approached. Of a presence that felt ancient, watching the village from a place beyond understanding. One entry stood out, it hunts in the silence. The villagers looked at each other. That same oppressive silence had followed them all day, outside the fields, inside the forest, near the body, near the cabin. Another entry read, it seeks what we buried, but we no longer remember where. A few villagers exchanged pale glances. Buried what? Who buried it? And why had the knowledge vanished from memory? History repeats, Bibi Rahil whispered, closing the journal. Because we allow it to. Every generation forgets what the last one tried to warn. And when the sky turned red last night, I remembered these pages. A young man stepped forward, voice trembling. If this happened before, how did it stop? The old woman raised her eyes, filled with an emotion no one could read. It didn't stop, she said. The journal never says it ended. Only that it waited. Inspector Adil felt a chill crawl up his spine. Everything they had seen, the patterns, the unnatural silence, the footprints, the missing man, now seemed less like isolated incidents and more like pieces of a returning cycle. A cycle that began in 1923. And perhaps long before that. The villagers stood frozen, the weight of the journal's revelation sinking into their bones. The past was no longer past. It was unfolding again. And somewhere in the forest, somewhere beneath the soil or behind the shadows, something was following the same steps it had walked a century ago. The missing page was the key. And its absence was a warning in itself. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, the fear gripping the village had transformed into something sharper, an urgent need for explanations that didn't rely on superstition or century-old journals. Whispers of curses and omens were no longer enough. The villagers wanted proof. They wanted reason. They wanted something they could fight. Inspector Adil understood this better than anyone. And though he respected Bibi Rahil's account and the chilling parallels of the journal, he also knew human minds could turn coincidence into prophecy when desperate enough. He needed facts. Evidence. Something tangible to hold on to. So he made a call. He contacted a small investigative team from the nearby district, one that specialized in environmental anomalies, geological disturbances, and unexplained natural events. They weren't paranormal experts, but they had tools, training, and open minds. By late afternoon, a van rolled in, carrying 2 scientists and a technician who looked far more confident than they would soon feel. They began collecting samples immediately. Soil from the scorched patterns. Ash-like residue from Miriam's fingertips. Leaves surrounding the metallic shard found in the forest clearing. Even water from the abandoned well, which one scientist claimed smelled faintly metallic. The villagers hovered at a distance, watching with equal parts hope and suspicion. If science could explain what happened, perhaps the fear would lift, at least, enough to sleep through the night. While the team worked, Adil joined them, asking questions and offering every detail he had gathered. The lead scientist, Dr. Samina, listened carefully. She was a serious woman, analytical to the bone, and unshakable, until she touched the soil sample from the circular burn marks. "It's warm," she murmured, startled. "But the temperature reading is below ambient heat." She checked again. Same result. Warm to the touch. Cold on the meter. "Thermal inconsistency," she said aloud, though even she didn't sound convinced. "Possibly residual energy from something." "From what?" Adil asked. "We'll know once we run a full test." But they didn't need to wait long for something stranger. Inside the van, the technician ran the first soil analysis. Within moments, the machine paused, beeped, and displayed an error message. "That's odd," he muttered. "It can't read the compound composition." "How is that possible?" Samina asked sharply. "It's detecting elements, but none of them match standard profiles. It's like," he hesitated. "Like the sample is coated with something unfamiliar." Adil frowned. "Unfamiliar how?" "As in, not from this region. Or maybe not from anywhere we've catalogued." The scientist didn't say what the villagers feared, not from Earth. But the implication hung heavily in the air. Before anyone could process the unsettling results, another anomaly emerged. The ash from Miriam's fingertips reacted violently during testing, sparking, sizzling, releasing a faint red glow for several seconds before cooling again. The scientist ran the test twice more, and each time, the substance behaved as though it were moving, rearranging itself under the microscope. "Organic?" Adil asked. "Partially," she whispered. "But part of it isn't. It's fused. As if something biological bonded with something metallic." The villagers who overheard her staggered back in fear. The team then examined the metallic shard from the forest. At first glance, it looked like a natural mineral fragment, flat, smooth, and irregularly shaped. But when they scanned it with magnetic and electrical sensors, it produced readings none of them had ever seen. "It's generating a pulse," the technician said. "But not electromagnetic. Not thermal." He swallowed. "Something else." "What kind of something else?" Adil pressed. He shook his head, frustrated. "I don't know. It's like it's alive, but not in any way we understand." As they conducted test after test, one thing became alarmingly clear: science had no framework for what they were dealing with. Every data point contradicted itself. Every reading defied logic. Every sample behaved unpredictably. The forest footprints, when cast in plaster, dissolved the plaster itself. The water from the well separated into layers that refused to recombine no matter how much they were shaken. Whatever force had touched this village didn't follow natural laws. Night crept closer, the dimming light casting long shadows across the ground. The scientists, though committed to their work, grew increasingly uneasy. Even the hum of their equipment seemed subdued, as though the silence the forest carried had seeped into the village. A small crowd gathered around the van when Dr. Samina finally stepped out, wiping sweat from her brow. Her confident composure had cracked. "I need to be honest," she said to Adil. "What we found doesn't match any known environmental or biological phenomenon. These substances, whatever they are, they behave as if they originate beyond our scientific understanding." Adil expected confusion. Fear. But not anger. A middle-aged man shouted, "So you're saying it's supernatural? That we were right all along?" "No," she said firmly. "I'm saying it's unexplained. Not impossible." But this didn't reassure anyone. Another villager stepped forward, trembling. "What about the red sky? Can your science explain that?" Samina inhaled slowly. "There are rare atmospheric events that cause red glows, solar storms, dust interference, electromagnetic disturbances. But none of them match the kind of." Before she could finish, the technician called out urgently. "You need to see this." They rushed to the van. The screen displayed the molecular structure of the soil sample, but something was happening in real time. The structure was shifting, rearranging itself as though responding to something outside the machine. The villagers gasped. The scientists froze. The soil was reacting to something in the environment. No, responding. And then, without warning, a low tremor rolled through the ground, not strong enough to knock anything over, but steady enough to make the van rattle. The machine beeped again. This time not an error. A reading. What is it? Adil asked. Samina stared at the screen, her face draining of color. This compound, whatever it is, it doesn't match any earthly signature. She swallowed hard. It matches nothing in our global database. Nothing found naturally. Nothing synthesized. Then where is it from? Someone demanded. She glanced at the forest, the same direction the red sky's glow seemed to pulse from. I don't know, she whispered. But I don't think it came from here. A hush fell over everyone. A realization so heavy it seemed to bend the air around them. If science couldn't explain the night sky, the symbols, the body, the silence, or the substance, then the explanation existed outside what humanity understood. And if the soil sample was still reacting, then whatever came under the red sky wasn't done yet. Something was still moving. Still searching. Still waking. And the village was running out of time. As evening shadows stretched long across the village, the results from the scientific tests had done nothing to calm the people. If anything, fear thickened like fog. The villagers whispered among themselves, glancing nervously toward the forest, toward the fields, toward the sky that they prayed would remain its natural color. But dread had a way of creeping into places even light couldn't reach. And now, it crept into their memories. Because buried beneath panic and superstition was something far more dangerous, the truth they had chosen to forget. It began subtly, with an old man named Raymond standing near the well, his hands trembling as if he fought an internal battle. He stared into the darkness below, the very place the strange metallic echoes had come from the night before. When Inspector Adil approached, Raymond finally spoke, voice cracking, heavy with guilt. I knew this would happen again, he muttered. I knew the moment the sky turned red. Adil stiffened. What do you mean again? Raymond didn't meet his eyes. He didn't have to. The way his shoulders sagged under invisible weight told Adil enough. My father told me, he continued, voice low, that what came in 1923 wasn't the first time. And it wouldn't be the last. Adil felt the ground shift beneath his certainty. Your father saw this. He survived it, Raymond whispered. But he never spoke freely. Only in fragments. Hints. Warnings. His gaze drifted toward the forest. He said some things must remain buried. Because if they surface, they will search for what was taken from them. What was taken? Adil pressed. What did the village do? Raymond's silence was louder than any confession. But he wasn't the only one whose memories stirred. Word spread quickly that the scientists believed the phenomenon wasn't earthly. And though superstition and faith fought for dominance over logic, one thing united everyone: something had been awakened. That night, as villagers gathered restlessly near the square, an elderly woman named Layla, one of the very few who rarely spoke, finally stepped forward. Her eyes, milky with age, held stories older than anyone expected. You want answers, she said softly. But you won't like them. The crowd gathered around her, shivering under the cooling air. When I was a child, she began, I heard hushed arguments between the elders. They believed something lived beneath the valley. Something ancient. Something we were meant to stay away from. A murmur rippled through the crowd. After the first red sky, long before 1923, our ancestors found something in the forest. Something they should have left alone. What did they find? A villager asked, trembling. A structure, she replied. Not a building. Not a cave. Something, unnatural. They say it wasn't created by human hands. Adil leaned closer, heart thudding. What did they do with it? Layla's expression hardened. They hid it. Buried it. And swore an oath that no one must ever disturb that place again. Raymond nodded shakily. That is the debt mentioned in the journal. The one my father warned me about. The missing page suddenly made sense, because her grandfather must have written the exact location of that buried structure. A location so dangerous, so forbidden, someone had torn it out to protect the village. But protect it from what? Layla continued, voice cracking. After they buried it, the sign stopped. No red sky. No missing people. No strange symbols. For decades, the valley slept. But something changed, Adil murmured. Something woke it again. Heads turned toward the forest. A sharp silence fell. Then another voice, unexpected, trembling yet determined, broke the stillness. It belonged to a man who seldom spoke, Yusuf, a 50-year-old villager with sunken eyes and a face marked by years of regret. You want to know what changed, he whispered. I'll tell you. The villagers leaned in as he clenched his fists, breathing hard. My son. 4 years ago. Several gasps echoed. Adil frowned. Your son left the village, didn't he? That's what I told you all, Yusuf said, tears pooling. But it was a lie. He didn't leave by choice. What do you mean? He found something, Yusuf admitted, voice shaking. Something metallic buried near the old riverbed. He brought it home thinking it was valuable scrap. I told him to put it back. I begged him. What happened to him? Bibi Rahil asked gently. Yusuf's voice broke. He disappeared. The next morning. No footprints. No struggle. Nothing. A heavy silence settled. You all believed he ran away. I let you believe it. He wiped his eyes. But I knew. I knew. He had disturbed something. Something that had been sleeping. Something that had been waiting. The villagers shuddered. Generational guilt now twisted with present terror. Inspector Adil tried to regain control of the moment. If something was disturbed, why now? Why the red sky? Layla closed her eyes. Because whatever was buried, is no longer buried. Her words struck like thunder. At that precise moment, a child's scream tore through the square. Panic erupted. People rushed toward the sound, searching for danger. But the child wasn't hurt, he was pointing at the ridge. At the forest line. Where a faint, pulsing red glow shimmered between the trees, barely visible, but unmistakably alive. No one dared move. And then, almost too softly to hear, a voice behind the crowd said, I know what caused all this. The villagers turned. Standing at the edge of the square was a man they had barely noticed all day. Thin, trembling, his clothes caked with dirt. His eyes hollow but sharp. It was Majid, the wandering shepherd who seldom spoke but always listened. His face looked as though he had witnessed something no human should ever see. What do you know? Adil asked cautiously. Majid swallowed hard. I saw who dug up the buried structure, he whispered. I saw what they pulled out from the earth. The villagers froze, breath held, eyes wide. And I saw, he continued, voice trembling, what started moving inside it when the sky turned red. The air went still. The truth, long buried, had finally begun to surface. And it was worse than any of them had imagined. They reached the clearing just as the last light of day bled into the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gold. The same clearing where the trees bent outward, where the soil felt wrong, where the metallic shard had been found humming faintly. But now, something else waited at the center, something half buried, as if the earth itself had tried to swallow it back. A circular object, smooth and dark, pulsed softly beneath the dirt. Not metal. Not stone. Something in between. It throbbed with a slow, rhythmic glow, red, then dim, then red again. Like a heartbeat. Inspector Adil stepped closer, every instinct screaming for him to stop. The villagers hung back, gripping lanterns like lifelines. Majid's voice trembled behind him. That's what they unearthed. The same thing our ancestors buried to keep the night silent. Adil knelt, brushing away the soil. Strange symbols, matching those burned into the fields, wrapped around its edge. As he touched them, the ground shivered. The glow strengthened. And then the object began to open. A thin seam widened across its surface, releasing a low, echoing hum that vibrated through the trees. The villagers stumbled back, terrified. Inside the widening crack, something shifted, fluid, shadow-like, alive. And as the red glow intensified, washing over their faces, Adil understood, the sky had not warned them. It had summoned something back. And now, it was waking.